Hello and welcome to the long-awaited analysis of the Dark Triad, which refers to the personality traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism and psychopathy in psychology. These three traits are called dark because of their malevolent qualities. I know all of this sounds very sophisticated and psychological, but we're going to be doing a very generic analysis. In fact, it's coming straight from Wikipedia. I've done that on purpose because I want to keep it as generic and as accessible and as unbiased as possible. If we return to that slide of Nicole Kessinger, as quoted by the Denver Post, saying that I don't think there's a logical explanation for what he did. Think of that word logical and think of the word psychological. And there is such a thing as logic in terms of psychology, and that's what we're really going to be looking at here. Unfortunately, the way psychology kind of works is we tend to project our own psychology onto someone else's psychology. So something that is psychologically logical for us may not be logical in terms of what's actually going on, and that's something that I want to touch on in terms of the Dark Triad. I've been meaning to cover this topic for some time. I think I was also in two minds about whether to just have it in a narrative, but I guess I'm going to be doing it for you folks on Patreon. Something just to mention is in the book My Daddy is a Hero, the word triad in relation to Dark Triad is mentioned once. I think it's on page 250, and it's in reference to Craig Malkin's book Rethinking Narcissism. And the author there refers to true narcissists, and where they, at their worst, they display two other traits of the Dark Triad: a complete lack of remorse and a penchant for manipulation. And we're going to be looking at all three of these traits. Just to be clear, in this particular reference, which is again quoted from Craig Malkin's book, so it's in My Daddy's a Hero, but it's a quote from someone else's book, she's referring to Malkin saying, in terms of narcissists, that, and I quote, and this is again a quote from Craig Malkin's book, they stop thinking that their partners are the best or most important people in the room because they need to claim that distinction for themselves, and they lose the capacity to see the world from any point of view other than their own. These are the true narcissists. In the remainder of Lena Derhali's book, she refers to psychopaths 48 times, and she references the word narcissism 28 times, and narcissist 55 times. So by far the most references are to the whole category of narcissism, and then to a lesser extent psychopathy. I could be mistaken, but she doesn't seem to refer to the Machiavellianism very much, although I think instead of that term, I think she refers to the capacity to manipulate instead of using that word. And the word manipulate appears 15 times. So if narcissism is the champion reference in her book, written by a psychologist, then next up is psychopathy, and then finally manipulation, which is as I say, a Machiavellian trait and part of the Dark Triad. Before we get going on today's episode, I just want to thank all the new patrons on Patreon. It's good to have you guys here. I'm going to be doing quite a lot more content on the subject of narcissism. I'm looking forward to hearing your responses and your comments and your feedback. For those of you who've read My Daddy's a Hero, but also just in general your thoughts on this particular subject. And without any further ado, let's get started. Okay, I'm quoting directly from the Wikipedia page on the Dark Triad, and what it says right in the beginning, in the introduction, it says that research on the Dark Triad is used in applied psychology, especially within the fields of law enforcement, clinical psychology, and even business management. And what they say is that people who score high in these traits are far more likely to commit crimes, to cause social distress and create severe problems for an organization, especially if they're in leadership positions. And so this doesn't only have a bearing on crime, it also has a bearing on society and on companies. Companies want to check whether the people they're hiring, they may not commit crimes, they may not commit fraud, but they might cause distress to their colleagues. They may infect the business culture with dark impulses and unhealthy thinking. The Wikipedia page concludes in terms of the introduction by saying people that have these traits tend to be less compassionate, agreeable, empathetic, satisfied with their lives, and less likely to believe they and others are good. I don't really like the way it's worded, because the way it's worded here is that people that conform to the Dark Triad are less compassionate, agreeable, empathetic, satisfied with their lives. I think the way it should be expressed is they are less compassionate, less agreeable, less empathetic, less satisfied with their lives, and less likely to believe they and others are good. So we're going to take the cue from the Wikipedia article and kind of deal with the triad step by step. We're going to start with the worst of the three, which is Machiavellianism. Then we're going to go into the psychopathy and finish with the narcissism. That's not quite the same order that it's dealt with in the Wikipedia piece, but it's still within the descriptions of the Wikipedia piece. So what is interesting is that these three traits are very distinct from one another, and yet some aspects of each of these traits tend to overlap in some way. So what one can then say is when we say overlap, there's some reinforcement where the one trait infects and pushes and agitates other antisocial traits in another area, if that makes sense. So we're going to start with Machiavellianism, and it refers to someone who is very manipulative and very exploitative of others. And together with this, there's an absence of morality, there's unemotional callousness, and a higher level of self-interest. If we interrogate these traits in terms of Chris Watts, what we see is one can sort of gloss over the whole Chris Watts story and say, yes, Chris Watts is very manipulative. He was a liar. He exploited the fact that his wife was somewhere else and had an affair behind her back. He exploited his wife's business. Maybe he thought he was going to inherit it or something like that. And then also that the crime itself was very immoral. What he did with the children was extremely immoral and callous, and that Watts overall was unemotional and unemotionally callous, right? And that everything that he did, murdering his entire family, was all about his own self-interest. And on the surface that may seem absolutely apt, and we might tick that box and say absolutely, Chris Watts is a shining example of Machiavellianism. But it's a mistake to assess the traits of a criminal only through the prism of their crime. What you really want to do is look at how they behave in terms of the crime, also how they behave in terms of the aftermath of the crime, the immediate aftermath, how they behave in the longer term aftermath, and then also the backstory. So you really want a whole narrative, a whole identity to work with, and then see if you can check the box, and that's completely different. So when we go into the immediate aftermath, and we see how Chris Watts lied to the police officers and lied to Nicole Atkinson and went on the Sermon on the Porch, well, yes, he was manipulating people. That's not very different to many other criminals. So one can't really say that that manipulation is some kind of red flag. We've just seen the guy from Texas, Sean Carey, doing the exact same thing. Does that mean he's also a guy with the whole Dark Triad sort of branded on his forehead? And so we don't know him very well, so it's really premature to even speculate on that. But Chris Watts we do know. And where this whole argument starts to unravel is when we see how when Chris Watts tried to manipulate the investigators, they also manipulated him, and they succeeded. He ultimately confessed to killing Shanann. Just that isn't manipulative. Him admitting that isn't manipulative. He's being honest about it. In terms of exploitation, one could say that yes, he exploited Shanann by blaming her. It's difficult to say whether Watts was being clever by not instantly blaming her. Maybe he planned to blame her all along, but one certainly doesn't get the idea that he's an exploitative person. We don't get the feeling that he took her money, that he stole her money, or that he badmouthed Shanann behind her back to Kessinger. We don't get the idea from Kessinger that Watts was that kind of person. We don't get that idea either from Watts, that he's sort of blaming Kessinger. He sort of puts the blame more on her in the second confession, but in the beginning he doesn't want to involve her at all. And that's almost a moral perspective, to say I don't want to involve this person. I don't want to get her into trouble. I don't want to talk about her, even though she was so central to what he did. When you talk about an absence of morality, there's a counter to this, which is also that, and I realize it's a controversial and maybe even unpalatable thing to think or even to say, but in a weird way, Watts was taking responsibility, obviously in a horrible way and in an immoral way, but he was taking responsibility for his situation that he was in by doing what he did. Obviously that's not the way that we tend to think of being responsible, but within the moral confines of his affair, he wanted to be in the moral right place so that he could continue his affair. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not trying to argue that what he did was moral. I'm just trying to say that there's not a complete absence of morality in the way that Machiavellianism is characterized by that. So when Watts said, also when he admitted to the affair and he said, I feel terrible about it, I think that he did. When Watts said, the fact that Shanann was pregnant and I cheated on her, I feel terrible about that, I think that was really eating at him. And if he not only felt bad about it in terms of himself, I think he knew how bad Kessinger would feel about it if she knew. And so he was aware of that moral imperative. When we talk about unemotional callousness, when Shanann went through Nutgate and told him about it, Watts was quite sensitive. He didn't blame her, he wasn't angry with her. Only much later did he say, you put a dagger between me and my father. one could obviously argue how he disposed of the bodies was callous, but if we go beyond the crime itself, what seemed to be kind of a warm-hearted guy that was in touch with his children and in touch with his wife, and the kind of guy that his wife could send a self-help book and she'd expect him to read it. The kind of guy that his wife would write a love letter to, and under normal circumstances he would be moved and touched to write back. The kind of guy that typically responded to messages, you know, just generally he would respond to messages and with loving, kind, you know, messages. I don't think that necessarily means you not callous if your texts are you know, heartfelt in some way, because anyone can send a nice text. But I guess part of it is when someone's in distress, how do you treat them when they're in distress? And there's not a lot of swearing between this couple. There's not a lot of callousness, certainly from his side, where he might have wanted to say, look, I'm done. Instead he said it in kind of a humble way, saying, you know, I'm scared to death having this child. He's kind of being honest with his wife, saying, you know, I'm terrified having this third child. I don't want to have this child. And so he's not trying to manipulate her there, he's trying to tell her. And then in terms of self-interest, I think one can definitely make the argument that he committed this crime for his self-interest. But what about everything else? What about him not wanting to be in these Thrive videos and then being in them to satisfy his wife? You could argue that he was doing that out of mutual self-interest because it was her job, but think about it yourself. If you, someone who really doesn't like something, no matter what the perks, no matter what the surrounding things, if you don't like something and you're kind of an arsehole about it, you might just say, no, under no circumstances am I going to do that. But what's for someone, his wife could twist his arm into doing pretty much anything that she wanted him to do, including the laundry for the entire family. So that whole idea of him being completely manipulative and self-interested doesn't quite play, does it? When we open up the sort of generic description of Machiavellianism, Wikipedia describes it as a psychological trait centered on interpersonal manipulation, unemotional coldness, and indifference to morality. Think about Chris Watts in terms of his work colleagues and how good he was at his job. You know, he won many bonuses. I think he won sort of gift cards for his conscientiousness at work, more so than other workers. He dressed neatly. One doesn't get the sense that he manipulated his colleagues, just besides the fact that he was quite reserved. He didn't tell them much about his private life. One also doesn't get the sense that he manipulated Kissinger that much. Obviously he did, to the extent that she was interested and wanted to maintain the affair, but he was also honest about their finances, the state of their finances, and that's quite interesting, is that he didn't seem to be playing the card that he's really wealthy and that he, you know, that he was some kind of stud muffin because he had a lot of money and a big house. It seemed that he was quite honest about that aspect. He also seemed to be quite honest about Thrive, that there were certain aspects about it that maybe he didn't work for him, and so he wanted to lose weight and get fitter by eating properly, as opposed to just taking medication or just taking pills and putting on patches. if Watts was a manipulator, one can almost expect him to have been far more on social media, far more active on social media than he was. If he was a skilled manipulator, we would have expected him to do better at getting away with this crime, and also make an attempt to get away with the crime, taking it to court and you know, taking his chances. If Watts was such a good manipulator, he would have been able to have fooled his wife about the affair. He did, but certainly not for very long. As soon as she got home, it was almost like over. As soon as Shanann came home from North Carolina, the clock started ticking. But I think the most important and pertinent point is, if Watts was this big manipulator, he would have been far better at his social game, and he would have been far better at his social media game. And again, one wonders what was going on with that doll covered in the plastic blanket. That does seem like a kind of a manipulative thing to send. That does seem to be quite dark. But overall, I think Watts scores very low on this most dangerous trait of all, which is why I think De Harley hardly references it. She references manipulation only about 15 times. Then we go on to psychopathy, which De Harley references quite a few times, 48 times. And in this respect, Wikipedia describes psychopathy as characterized by continuous antisocial behavior, and also by impulsivity, and also by selfishness, and also by callous and unemotional traits, and then also by remorselessness. I'm not sure I like that word remorselessness, because it seems to imply, you know, if there's remorselessness, isn't it you just very persistent? But I know what they're getting at. It's to do with never having remorse. So just a state of remorselessness. I still don't like the word though in that context. But let's take it one at a time. Psychopathy is characterized by continuous antisocial behavior. Now, that shouldn't be mistaken for someone who is an introvert, someone who is quiet and reserved. Someone who's quiet and reserved isn't necessarily antisocial. It just means that they are quiet and reserved. Antisocial is in the other direction, where you do something that is opposite to healthy behavior. So if you remember, those of you who've read any of my books, I mentioned Roy Orbison as a introvert who became a rock star. And you might think, well, his introversion couldn't have been very serious if that's what he did, but it was. And that's why he wore dark glasses, and it was something that didn't change much over many years and many concerts. You know, once an introvert, always an introvert. You might become better at dealing with it, but that kind of thing, putting on dark glasses and appearing weird on stage and not moving much and appearing quite stiff, that's not Roy Orbison being antisocial. That's Roy Orbison being an introvert, someone feeling a bit awkward when surrounded by a lot of people. But he's doing what he's doing because he loves what he's doing, right? Antisocial behavior is like, instead of doing something that is pro-social, like getting a divorce, or pro-social like getting married, or pro-social like engaging with someone, you will do something else like avoid confrontation, or do something in a deceitful way, right? I'm not sure whether you could classify an affair as antisocial. I guess you could argue that it is, that it's breaking the fabric of society, but you could also argue that it's engaging with another person, in the same way that you can argue engaging with a prostitute isn't antisocial. It is It is, by its very nature, a social interaction. You could argue that it's not moral, or it's not intimate, but I don't think you could say it's antisocial. Are you following where I'm coming from? And so I don't know where one can apply the antisocial aspect to Chris Watts. You can certainly say that the crime that he committed was extremely antisocial. I mean, committing a murder is very antisocial behavior. But again, you've got to take it further than that and say beyond the crime, which definitely was psychopathic and had elements of Machiavellianism in it, in terms of manipulating people. What about these traits beyond the crime? And Chris Watts didn't seem very antisocial. He was well liked by his colleagues. He was seemingly a good worker and a guy who looked out for the people around him. And he was also a good father. He was a good husband. He was a good son-in-law and a good son. So we don't really see any of that antisocial behavior coming in there. There's no criminal record prior to this. If we take the other psychopathic traits like impulsivity, Watts doesn't seem very impulsive. There's an aspect to this crime that feels a bit impulsive, but it's also premeditated. So if the crime was that it just snapped, then one could say that does show psychopathy, but the fact that it's premeditated certainly goes into the Machiavellian aspect, but again, it's within the crime. What about aside from the crime? And one could also argue that the premeditation is typical of an introvert. An introvert is inside his head, is thinking, is calculating. What's he going to say? How's he going to respond to the situation, etc., etc. So that's how one needs to think about it. One needs to take it to that point as well. So Watts didn't seem very impulsive. He stuck to his job. He wasn't someone who had many affairs. He had this one affair, and it's not like he had the affair and then he jumped back into his marriage. A lot of people do that. A lot of people will they'll be in a marriage and they'll cheat numerous times. I don't know if I want to say this, but I guess I am. A credit to Watts is the fact that he met somebody and he felt so strongly that we wanted to commit to that person. If you take the crime away, that at least is something, is that he met someone and it wasn't just a fling, it wasn't just he seemingly felt a strong connection and was going to commit to this person. And then obviously it blew up, the whole thing blew up horribly for everybody. But I just want to differentiate that from somebody who was just like a serial womanizer, a serial cheater. And I think Scott Peterson was a little bit more like that than Chris Watts. A bit more of a charmer and a kind of a ladies' man kind of thing. In terms of selfishness, I didn't get that idea either. I think if Chris Watts was selfish, he would have not permitted the debt to get to the point that it did. He would not have handed over his salary check every month. He would have taken control. I think selfishness is a lot about being in control and maybe stepping on somebody else. And if anything, Watts' introversion made him unselfish, too unselfish. In terms of callous and unemotional traits, people liked Watts. Chris Watts' wife liked Watts, wanted to be married to him. And the fact that everybody said that Chris Watts appeared colder to Shanann in those last weeks, well, compared to what? Compared to Chris Watts being a warm, kind, affectionate person. He couldn't be seen to be standoffish if he wasn't warm and kind to begin with, if that makes sense. In terms of the remorselessness, I've dealt with that before. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail here, but when a criminal is trying to appear nonchalant, and Shane Carey is trying to do the same thing, trying to appear that he doesn't know anything about something, plausible deniability, he's purposefully hiding his remorse, or he's purposefully putting away some natural emotions that might be there, like grief or pain or whatever, whatever the original emotions were that were operative and feeding into the crime. So one's got to bear that in mind as part of criminal psychology. If you had to ask Chris Watts, do you feel bad about the crime? I think Cadell said that he never said that he was sorry. But one does kind of get the sense that if Watts doesn't know to say that he was sorry, or that he wished that he didn't do what he did, he's certainly symbolically making up for that, or pretending to make up for that, or whatever you want to call it, by putting pictures of his family in his jail cell, reading stories to, I guess, pictures of his children, thinking about Shanann every day. That is a kind of remorse. You could argue that it's acted remorse. It may not be genuine remorse, but that's certainly better than no remorse. I mean, there are a lot of criminals and psychopaths that simply just don't show it whatsoever, and so somebody acting it out is at least a demonstration of it, and maybe it is, maybe there is some remorse. Chris Watts shedding a tear at the sentencing hearing, I don't like to think of that as remorse myself. I like to it feels more like just feeling bad, just a overall sense of shame and feeling really bad about everything. And I don't necessarily mean that he feels sorry about it. I just mean that he's just very broken by the result, and by hearing these words, and by being in the situation that he's in. But again, that is someone showing emotions, not callous and unemotional. And we also get kind of a sense of Chris Watts's, I don't want to say empathy, but his sense of wanting to connect to the investigators that are questioning him. He seems to want to appear one of their friends. He wants them to like him. And that's someone who's trying to be pro-social, is making an effort, even with his investigators. There would be nothing stopping Chris Watts from being investigated and simply saying, listen, I'm not going to talk to you, and I'm going to get a lawyer, and it's going to be like drawing blood from a stone. You're not going to get anything out of me. And a good example of someone like that, I guess, is Patrick Frazee. I think Patrick Frazee's got far more antisocial traits than Chris Watts. Not only in the execution of the crime and the destruction of the body, but just in general, I think Patrick Frazee is a much more antisocial animal in terms of true crime. He didn't ever speak to the media. He lawyered up very quickly. He didn't even testify in court, and he recruited other people into his diabolical scheme, and threatened them, and spoke to a jailhouse snitch and wanted to recruit him into a murderous scheme again, with a hit list. That's very antisocial behavior. Wikipedia also refers to impaired empathy and remorse. I guess it means impaired remorse. Bold, disinhibited and egotistical traits. None of those apply to Chris Watts. I wouldn't describe Chris Watts as bold in any way. I wouldn't describe Chris Watts as disinhibited in any way, although possibly in the bedroom with his mistress, one might say that he would be. And he doesn't seem egotistical when left alone. I mean, he seemed somewhat egotistical in the Sermon on the Porch and when he was interrogated, but even his neighbors said, he never talks this much. He's far more quiet, he's far more reserved. So he doesn't strike one as an egotist. One can certainly say when he lost weight and when his appearance improved, that is, so did his ego. But it's not an ego from the point of view of someone with a big ego. It's relative to an introvert with a very little ego. And so his ego was somewhat bigger, but it's still, again, you've got to do it within the construct of an introvert. Think of Roy Orbison playing to a massive crowd, a concert. His ego may be improved, but that's not going to turn him into an extrovert. He's still going to be an introvert. Same with Chris Watts, him having, developed his physique and his fitness may improve his ego, but it's not going to turn him into someone else. It's not going to turn him from an introvert to an extrovert, or from a guy with lowish self-esteem to an egotist. But that certainly is a factor. But I don't think it's really relevant to psychopathy. And this brings us to the third dimension, to the Dark Triad, and it's the one that's the favorite of most people, I think. And I honestly believe that most people don't understand Chris Watts that are talking about him. When I say that, what I'm kind of getting at is most people who refer to Chris Watts and refer to narcissism are not understanding Chris Watts' psychology. And I understand how the conversation goes, but you're not a psychologist, you don't know anything about it. Fine, carry on believing what you want to believe. But I nevertheless maintain that the narcissism narrative is completely irrelevant to this case. It's completely irrelevant to Chris Watts. If you want to force it to be relevant, you can talk about the social media aspect and the fact that he didn't want to participate. That's one way of addressing it. Another way is you could talk about Chris Watts's narcissism in terms of, if you want a better life, is that healthy narcissism or not, right? Wanting to have a better life with somebody else, is that a healthy response to one situation? And then one can also talk about the narcissism related to looking better, feeling better, being perhaps the more attractive spouse, and the more attractive spouse cheats, just as he said in that relationship video. So if you want to force the narcissism narrative, you can, but it doesn't really fuel the whole criminal aspect. And I guess the only way that it sort of does, if you want to talk about it, is Chris Watts didn't want anyone to know about what he did. He wanted to commit the murder and get away with it. He wanted to hide what he did. But that's typical of any criminal. So again, it's typical run-of-the-mill narcissism. It's not unique to Chris Watts. If we go by Wikipedia's description, it describes narcissism as grandiosity, pride, egotism, and a lack of empathy. Now, I would argue that Chris Watts doesn't have any of those qualities, and I know how someone would counter that and say, yes, but he's a covert narcissist. Okay, well, go on with that counter argument, in your own time. Or you might say, no, he's a communal narcissist. Can't quite remember how De Harley described him, but anyway, some elaborate subcategory of narcissist. I'm just sticking to the generic version of the Dark Triad here, and the Dark Triad refers to just basic characteristics, and Chris Watts doesn't have any of them. Chris Watts isn't someone that is all about grandiosity. An introvert is the opposite of grandiose. He's reserved. He doesn't want to be in the limelight. He doesn't want to be on social media. He doesn't want to have that attention. And Chris Watts going onto the porch and talking to the media was Chris Watts's idea of what he thought everyone wanted to see. And he wasn't very good at it. But that's not the natural Chris Watts. That's the criminal Chris Watts. That's Chris Watts projecting what he thinks you want to see. Is a sort of a balanced, chatty, nonchalant, normal guy. And if you want to take that sort of idea further, think about Clark Kent. Clark Kent isn't a real personality. It's the projection of Superman, who's an alien. And so what Superman is saying to society is, this is how I think society thinks of itself, which is a clumsy, weak, stuttering news reporter who wears glasses. That's Superman's criticism of the human race. And so in a funny way, Chris Watts, being chatty and manipulative and whatever in terms of his gameplay with the cops and during the Sermon on the Porch with the media and during his interrogation with the FBI, that's his critique of society as he sees it. Very communicative, very misleading, very charming, all that kind of stuff. He's basically trying to give you what you want. I'm not going to deal with pride, egotism, and lack of empathy, because I have already, except to say that it was Chris Watts who wanted to downscale, who wanted to scale, downsize the home. Not Shanann. It wasn't Shanann who was sort of trying to convince him to do it. It was Chris Watts who was very much wanting to do that. And one gets the impression that he wanted the same with his children, that he didn't want his children going to that school. One can say that's not pride, it was just the fact that he couldn't afford it. But pride and buying things you can't afford and living beyond your means go hand in hand. Chris Watts confessing to murder and Chris Watts taking a plea deal and Chris Watts turning to God doesn't feel a lot like pride. You could argue that him turning to God is a way of rescuing his pride, but that's a different argument. The fact that he took the plea deal and is in jail, didn't even go to trial, I think speaks of someone with no pride. I think there was a lot of shame in Chris Watts' life, and a lot of that is what prompted him to act in the way that he has. When we go to the expanded version of narcissism on Wikipedia, it refers to the pursuit of gratification from vanity or egotistical admiration of one's idealized self-image and attributes. This includes self-flattery, perfectionism, and arrogance. I don't really get that impression from Chris Watts. He doesn't seem very arrogant in general. He doesn't seem like he's flattering himself. If you think of Shanann on Facebook just saying what a great family they had and how great everything was, that's self-flattery. If you think of Shanann and her attitudes to perfectionism, that's perfectionism. That's idealized self-image. That's egotistic. That's vanity. Chris Watts didn't seem to be pursuing any of that. With one exception, through Nicole Kessinger, who listened to Chris Watts, who seemed to like him for who he was, there was a certain element of vanity. But I would argue that that's healthy. It's healthy to want to be with someone who likes you for who you are, not someone who doesn't like you for who you are, or makes fun of you for who you are, or doesn't really listen or acknowledge who you are. Somebody who wants somebody else. I can imagine in the Watts marriage, Shanann being frustrated, constantly frustrated and irked by the fact that Watts just didn't want to come to the party, didn't want to appear in his videos, he didn't want to help her build her business, he didn't want to dance to that tune and kind of perform. That must have really been annoying to her. But I think equally to Watts it must have been annoying to be constantly asked to perform when he's not a performer and he didn't want to be a performer. Watts seemed to be more interested in physical things like sandboarding and jogging and exercise and maybe sex and things like that than sitting in front of a camera and being validated in sort of virtual ways. Now, I remember in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, he referred to thin slicing relationships, just saying that something as complex as a marriage, or as a two people deciding to get married, they were able to assess whether these marriages would work, whether these relationships would last by measuring just one quality, and that quality was contempt. if there's any signs of contempt from either people in the relationship, then the chances of the relationship failing were very high, and that proved to be very, very accurate. Just that one thing, just a contempt. And so in the same way, when you look at the Dark Triad, you don't have to understand narcissism all that well. You don't have to understand the intricacies of Machiavellianism all that well. You don't have to know psychopathy off by heart. Instead, you just need to look at one particular trait, and that is known as low agreeableness. And according to a analysis carried out by the Glasgow Caledonian University, actually think I did a medical trial there once upon a time. In any event, low agreeableness, the university found to be the strongest correlate of the Dark Triad. So you tend to find this low agreeableness in all three of these aspects, while neuroticism and a lack of conscientiousness were associated with some of the Dark Triad members. So your number one aspect, your number one correlate that is going to confirm that someone is infected with this Dark Triad is low agreeableness, and then neuroticism is also part of that, and lack of conscientiousness as well. Now, if I look at that, I know I'm pretty neurotic. I think as an author, very, very anxious about lots of different things, just a very hyper alert and hyper aware. So that makes me worry that, well, could it apply to me? But then lack of conscientiousness, I know I'm not. I'm very conscientious. So that wouldn't apply to me. And then low agreeableness, I can be quite disagreeable to people who criticize me. But I think in general I'm an agreeable person, which is why right now my cat is sitting with its head on my foot because it likes being with me. I don't think that's an absolutely excellent example that defines me as being agreeable, but I'm just saying I think it is important to test some of these qualities against yourself if you're going to try and analyze somebody else like Chris Watts in a fair way. And so if we try to understand agreeableness, what we're talking about, and this is again according to Wikipedia, again it's just a generic description. Agreeableness is a personality trait manifesting itself in individual behavioral characteristics that are perceived as kind, sympathetic, cooperative, warm, and considerate. In contemporary personality psychology, agreeableness is one of the 5 major dimensions of personality. And I don't know, if you had to ask me, I would say Chris Watts is a very agreeable person. That is why the portraits of the Watts family look so agreeable, look so perfect. Chris Watts is smiling, he looks agreeable, he's warm, he has his hands on his children and on his wife, in the sense of he's in touch with them in a kind, protective way. When he's with his girlfriend, he's kissing her and she is enjoying his attention. When he's with his children, they are enjoying being with their dad, even if it's on camera. They enjoy playing with him. Chris Watts wearing t-shirts saying "I'm a proud dad" is at least demonstrating or illustrating agreeableness. And this is why when we see that image from the Lifetime movie that's coming out, I think January the 28th, it kind of doesn't fit, because we see a disagreeable Chris there. And while I agree that I don't think the Watts family behind the scenes was happy, I think Chris Watts himself was quite an agreeable guy. If they went on a trip, I think he did his best to be agreeable. You can take that whole thing much, much further. Beyond the family, how was Chris Watts when the police spoke to him? he was quite agreeable. When Coonrod said, "Do you mind if I come in?" Chris Watts was very nonchalant and inviting him in. Sure, come on in. He didn't seem to show any ill feeling towards Nicole Atkinson, who'd sort of brought all of this upon him. He didn't seem to sort of hold a grudge or treat her in a bad way. You do see him looking at her in a kind of a panic deer in the headlights way every now and then. But by the same token, he also shows her the ring, and certainly Nicole doesn't feel so intimidated or so what's the word, endangered, I guess, by Chris Watts. She sort of hangs around the house, she sort of walks around the house, and it's because she knows Chris Watts is just in general agreeable. And if she's worried about Shanann, and she has a right to be, and she's totally justified in it, she's not very worried about him. When Chris Watts is in the interrogation, he's very agreeable in terms of, he literally agrees to the polygraph, and he's so agreeable that CBI agent Tammy Lee is able to talk to him for 3 hours. That's what we mean by kind of being agreeable before the crime, during the immediate aftermath of the crime, and beyond. I mean, he's also so agreeable that he agrees to the plea deal. In fact, if you read the letter of the discovery, you know, if you read it to the letter, you see that he says that the lawyers asked him hundreds of times, you know, would he be prepared to take the plea deal, and he agreed to it. So when we go through the rest of the Wikipedia article and we touch on again these same qualities, we should see how they don't apply to Chris Watts. Machiavellianism doesn't apply. It's about people who are cynical in the amoral self-interest sense, unprincipled, cold. They believe in interpersonal manipulation as the key for life success. If Chris Watts was like that, he would have been far more involved in Thrive than he was. I do think MLM is a lot about interpersonal manipulation and is in itself very Machiavellianist. So that's a separate argument. But I really don't get that sense from Chris Watts. He didn't seem very immoral besides this. One could argue that the debt, the very serious debt, was amoral, but then one could also accuse half of America of being amoral in that sense. I don't know if that's Machiavellianist or just greed or just poor impulse control. If you go to psychopathy, this is considered the most malevolent of the Dark Triad. Individuals who score higher on psychopathy show low levels of empathy combined with high levels of impulsivity and thrill seeking. So it's quite interesting that they say that psychopathy is the most malevolent of the three, even more than Machiavellianism. I would have thought Machiavellianism could be more malevolent, especially if the manipulation was extreme. But I think in either case, I think that the narcissism aspect is the least bad of the three. And Wikipedia describes that as individuals who score higher narcissism display grandiosity, entitlement, dominance, and superiority. Narcissism has also been found to correlate positively with extroversion and openness, and negatively with agreeableness. Narcissism has been found to have a significant correlation with psychopathy. And this is really the bottom line with Chris Watts. Chris Watts isn't an extrovert. Isn't also not someone who wants to be an extrovert secretly. It's not like a covert extrovert. He's also not a very open person. He's reserved. That's the opposite of being open. And he's also a agreeable person, whereas narcissism is often disagreeable to that extent that it's quite extreme. Chris Watts doesn't display grandiosity, or he'd be more on social media. He doesn't display entitlement, or he would be the one running the finances, and he'd be the one, buying everything and whatever. He did feel entitled to a better life, but so does anybody. Somebody choosing happiness is hardly entitlement. It is natural to want to improve your life and your circumstances. How he chose it certainly wasn't. Dominance doesn't apply to Chris Watts whatsoever, neither does superiority. And so you have this generic explanation, and then you have psychologists and the public who want to insist on the narcissism aspect being relevant, and it just isn't. I'm not going to take it further than that. It's almost an hour that I've been talking about this particular aspect. If you come across someone talking about narcissism, I want to encourage you to copy the unlisted link to this YouTube video and just send it to these people. More than likely they won't listen to it, because it's hard to fill up a cup that's already full, but it's worth a try, I guess. Thank you for listening. Look out for episode 3 in the Atkinson transcripts tomorrow, as well as part 5 in Christopher Watts, What Else Do We Know, the series on YouTube. I'm not sure if that'll be available tomorrow, but certainly soon. Again, thank you for your support on Patreon. Let me know what you think about this video, what you agree with, what your ideas are. I'd also be interested to hear how many of you have read the book I've written on Patrick Frazee, and what you think, how the Dark Triad might apply to him. And would you be interested in a book on Shane Carey? Do you think that case is going to be the sort of equal to the Chris Watts case? And would you prefer the next book that I write to be on Chris Watts or on Shane Carey? Let me know, and I'll see you guys next time.